On March 14, 1971, city workers renovating a condemned brownstone in Brooklyn's Carroll Gardens neighborhood broke through a false wall in the basement and discovered something that would haunt forensic psychologists for decades. Behind 18 inches of brick and plaster, they found a chamber approximately 20 by 30 feet, its walls covered floor to ceiling with hand-painted biblical verses in Latin, Hebrew, and English. At the center stood an altar, constructed from marble and brass, surrounded by the skeletal remains of 11 people arranged in a perfect circle, each skull marked with a carved symbol, the Hebrew letter Tet, meaning serpent or evil. But it wasn't the bodies that made the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit classify this as one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. It was the genealogy. Painted on the ceiling in gold leaf was an elaborate family tree, starting with Abraham and ending with the name Sarto, specifically Domenico the Prophet Sarto, head of one of New York's most ruthless crime families. Beside each generation were biblical annotations claiming direct descent from King David, and handwritten justifications for over 60 murders dating back to 1923, each described as a divine judgment carried out by God's chosen instruments. How does an entire crime family convince themselves they're executing God's will through murder and extortion? What kind of patriarch transforms organized crime into holy war, turning soldiers into zealots who genuinely believe their violence is righteous? And how did the Sarto family operate for over 40 years in plain sight, their religious fanaticism hidden behind the facade of typical mob operations, until one act of ultimate blasphemy finally exposed the depths of their delusion? This is not a story about criminals who used religion as cover. This is a story about true believers who thought they were prophets, about a bloodline that considered itself sacred, and about the psychological horror of being raised to believe that murder was prayer and crime was worship. This is the story of the Sarto family, the mob dynasty that weaponized faith itself and left behind a legacy of bodies buried in the name of God. To understand how a crime family became a cult, we must go back to a bitter winter in 1923, to a small apartment in Manhattan's Lower East Side, where a semi-literate immigrant named Domenico Sarto had a vision that would doom 3 generations of his descendants. Domenico Sarto arrived at Ellis Island in 1919, one of thousands of Italian immigrants fleeing poverty and seeking the American dream. He was 23 years old, barely educated, with calloused hands from years of farm labor in Sicily, and eyes that burned with an intensity that made even hardened dock workers uncomfortable. He brought with him 3 things: a battered suitcase, a family Bible that had belonged to his grandfather, and an unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. The reality of immigrant life in New York crushed most men's dreams within months. The tenements were overcrowded, the work was brutal and poorly paid. The established Irish and Jewish gangs controlled everything worth controlling. Italians were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, stereotyped as criminals and anarchists, given the worst jobs and the least respect. But Domenico was different. While other immigrants broke their backs for pennies, he spent his evenings in the dim light of gas lamps, studying his grandfather's Bible with obsessive focus. He couldn't read well. His formal education had ended at age 8, but he'd memorized vast passages in Italian, and he pored over them looking for meaning, for purpose, for proof that his suffering had divine significance. The Bible he inherited was unusual. His grandfather, a village mystic who'd been half revered and half feared in their Sicilian town, had filled its margins with annotations claiming the Sarto family descended from Roman Jews who'd converted to Christianity in the 1st century. According to family legend, they were descendants of the tribe of Judah, bloodline relatives of King David himself, who'd hidden their Jewish heritage during centuries of persecution, but maintained secret knowledge of their sacred ancestry. Whether any of this was true was irrelevant. Domenico believed it with the fervor of a man desperate for identity in a world that treated him as worthless. And in January of 1923, during a particularly brutal cold snap that left him delirious with pneumonia, Domenico had the vision that would define the family's darkness for the next 50 years. He was alone in his tenement room, burning with fever, hovering between life and death. In his delirium, he saw himself standing before a throne of fire. A voice, which he would later insist was God's own voice, spoke to him in Italian, making a proclamation that Domenico would repeat thousands of times throughout his life. "You are of the line of David. You are my instrument in a corrupt world. The wicked prosper while the righteous suffer, but I have chosen your family to be judges. You will punish the evildoers and claim their wealth as tribute. Every man you judge, every fortune you seize, every enemy you strike down, these are holy acts. Build my kingdom with blood and gold, and your lineage will be blessed for 1,000 generations." When Domenico's fever broke 3 days later, he was transformed. The semi-literate immigrant who'd worked as a stevedore had become, in his own mind, a prophet. He began keeping a journal, written in broken Italian and phonetic English, documenting his divine mission. He started recruiting followers from the neighborhood, men who were attracted to his charisma and his promise that their criminal activities weren't sins, but sacred duties. By 1925, Domenico had assembled a crew of 12 men. He specifically chose 12, modeling his organization after Jesus' apostles, and they operated with a strange mixture of typical mob violence and religious ritual. Before every robbery, they prayed. After every murder, Domenico would bless the killer and absolve him of sin. Money from their criminal enterprises was divided into portions. 1/10 went to poor families in the neighborhood, Domenico's twisted version of tithing, and the rest funded expansion of what he called the righteous enterprise. Other mobsters found the Sarto strange but effective. Domenico's men fought with fanatical courage because they genuinely believed they were immortal souls doing God's work. They didn't fear death. They embraced it as martyrdom. This made them extraordinarily dangerous, and within 5 years, the Sarto crew had carved out significant territory in Lower Manhattan, controlling gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets. But the truly disturbing element was how Domenico began selecting targets. Most mob families operated pragmatically. They killed rivals, eliminated witnesses, and removed obstacles to profit. Domenico added a twisted moral dimension. He would study potential victims, investigating their lives, and then decide whether they were righteous or wicked based on his own biblical interpretations. A businessman who cheated his workers was wicked and deserved death. A cop who took bribes was wicked and deserved judgment. A rival mobster who showed mercy to enemies was wicked because he'd failed to fulfill God's command to smite the unrighteous. His crew, indoctrinated by years of Domenico's preaching, carried out these executions, believing they were holy. The psychological impact was profound. They weren't just criminals, they were warriors of God. Their consciences were seared by the conviction that murder was righteous when performed by the chosen. In 1928, Domenico married Lucia Greco, a deeply religious young woman from Naples who'd been raised in a convent school. She knew Domenico was involved in criminal activities, but he convinced her, with quotations from the Old Testament and appeals to his supposed divine calling, that he was a modern-day judge of Israel ordained by God to punish wickedness that the corrupt authorities ignored. Lucia believed him. More tragically, she helped him build the mythology that would trap their children. Together, they established the family's theological framework. Lucia, educated by nuns and fluent in Latin, helped Domenico create elaborate justifications for their lifestyle. She found biblical passages about the conquest of Canaan, about divinely ordained violence, about God's chosen people seizing the wealth of the wicked. She helped him construct a worldview where the Sarto family were not criminals but holy warriors, not thieves but righteous claimants of tribute owed to God's representatives on earth. Their first child, Giuseppe, was born in 1929. From his first breath, he was raised in a household where crime and faith were inseparable, where bedtime stories were about David slaying Goliath and Judah Maccabee leading holy revolts, where his father's business associates were described as apostles and soldiers in God's army, where the money that paid for their comfortable Brooklyn home, they'd moved up in the world, was explained as tribute from the conquered, like the spoils of war in the Old Testament. Giuseppe never had a chance at a normal moral development. By the time he was 5 years old, he'd absorbed the family's entire delusional framework. By 10, he was accompanying his father to judgments, witnessing murders that were described as executions of the wicked. By 15, he'd committed his first killing, and his father had blessed him afterward, anointing his forehead with oil and declaring him a true son of David. The second son, Marco, was born in 1931, followed by a daughter, Francesca, in 1933. Each was raised in the same twisted theology, each indoctrinated from infancy to believe the family was special, chosen, set apart by divine will. The Sarto home in Carroll Gardens became a bizarre fusion of Italian Catholic tradition and Old Testament zealotry, with crucifixes on every wall but prayers that called down judgment on enemies, with Sunday Mass attendance followed by Monday meetings where murders were planned as divine operations. By 1935, Domenico had renamed his organization. They were no longer just a crew or a gang. They were La Famiglia Eletta, the chosen family. And Domenico had begun construction of the chamber that would eventually become their tomb, a hidden sanctuary beneath their home where he could document the family's sacred genealogy and record their holy works without interference from the profane world above. The chamber's construction was overseen by Domenico personally, built by workers who were told it was a wine cellar and then systematically eliminated to preserve the secret. The walls were painted with biblical verses, Domenico's favorites, passages about divine vengeance and righteous judgment. The altar at the center was modeled after descriptions of Solomon's temple, constructed from the finest materials the family's growing wealth could provide. This chamber became the heart of the Sarto family's delusion. Here, Domenico would bring his sons to teach them their sacred history. Here, he kept detailed records of every murder, every criminal act, described in religious language as judgments and tributes. Here, he painted the elaborate family tree connecting them to King David, fabricating generations of ancestors with names pulled from the Bible and Italian history, creating a lineage that existed only in his fevered imagination. And here, starting in 1936, the bodies began to accumulate. Domenico had decided that certain enemies weren't just to be killed, but to be sacrificed. The distinction in his mind was profound. Regular murders were judgments, necessary but mundane. Sacrifices were offerings to God, people whose deaths would sanctify the family's mission and secure divine blessing for future generations. The first sacrifice was Salvatore Russo, a rival mobster who'd attempted to move into Sarto territory. Rather than simply having him shot in the street, Domenico orchestrated an elaborate ritual. Russo was brought to the chamber, bound to the altar, and forced to hear Domenico recite his sins, both real and imagined. Then, with his sons watching, Domenico performed what he called divine execution, killing Russo with a knife while reciting Psalm 149. Let the high praises of God be in their mouth and a two-edged sword in their hand, to execute vengeance on the nations and punishment on the peoples. Russo's body was interred in the chamber wall, and his skull was marked with the Hebrew letter Tet, the symbol Domenico had chosen to represent those judged as serpents. It was, in Domenico's twisted logic, an honor to be deemed worthy of sacrifice rather than mere assassination. Over the next 8 years, 10 more people would be sacrificed in that chamber, each one part of an increasingly elaborate religious framework that Domenico constructed to justify and sanctify the family's violence. But the true horror wasn't just Domenico's delusion. It was how completely he transmitted it to the next generation. Giuseppe Sarto, by 1944, was a 15-year-old who'd witnessed multiple ritual murders and believed with absolute conviction that his family was chosen by God. He kept his own journal, mimicking his father's style, documenting his spiritual development as a warrior of the righteous line. His entries are chilling in their sincerity. There's no doubt, no questioning, just pure belief. One entry from April 1944 reads, "Today, Father taught me the proper way to execute judgment. The wicked man must be given opportunity to confess his sins. If he repents, the blade should be swift, a mercy killing. If he remains defiant, the death should be slow, so he has time to consider his eternal fate. I understand now why we are different from other families. We are not criminals seeking profit. We are instruments of divine will, and every action we take is prayer made manifest." Marco Sarto, 3 years younger, was even more fervent. Where Giuseppe showed some strategic thinking and pragmatism, Marco was a pure zealot. He spent hours in the chamber, memorizing the biblical verses on the walls, studying the family tree, preparing himself for what he called my sacred inheritance. He begged his father to let him perform a sacrifice to prove his worthiness. Even young Francesca, 11 years old in 1944, had been completely indoctrinated. She helped her mother transcribe her father's visions and maintained the family's ritual calendar, marking days for special prayers, planning ceremonies around biblical feast days, tracking the phases of the moon because Domenico had decided lunar cycles had spiritual significance. The Sarto family had become a closed system of delusion, each member reinforcing the other's beliefs, creating an echo chamber where dissent was impossible and questioning meant betraying God himself. And then the war changed everything. World War II presented the Sarto family with what Domenico interpreted as a divine test. Other Italian-American mobsters were keeping low profiles, worried about anti-Italian sentiment and increased federal scrutiny. But Domenico saw opportunity. He began preaching that the war was apocalyptic, a battle between righteousness and wickedness on a global scale, and that the chosen family had a sacred duty to expand their operations, to seize more territory and wealth while others cowered. In reality, this was just opportunistic criminal expansion disguised as theology. But to the Sartos, it was divine mandate. They became more aggressive, more violent, more willing to take risks because they believed God was protecting them. By late 1944, the Sarto family controlled significant operations across Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. They had dozens of soldiers, multiple legitimate business fronts, and political connections bought through strategic bribes and blackmail. On the surface, they looked like any successful crime family. But beneath that surface, there was madness. Every major decision was made through divine consultation. Domenico would retreat to the chamber, pray for hours, and emerge with pronouncements he claimed came directly from God. Soldiers were required to attend weekly prayer meetings where biblical passages were read and applied to criminal operations. New members weren't just sworn to Omertà. They were baptized in a twisted ceremony where Domenico anointed them with oil and declared them adopted into the sacred line. The family's increasing religious fervor caught the attention of other mob bosses, particularly Charles Lucky Luciano, who'd established the commission to regulate organized crime and prevent the kind of internecine warfare that hurt business. Luciano found the Sartos profitable, but troubling. Their fanaticism made them unpredictable. Their belief in divine protection made them reckless. In December of 1944, Luciano called a sit-down with Domenico, ostensibly to discuss territorial boundaries, but really to assess whether the Sartos were becoming too unstable to be reliable partners. The meeting took place in a private room at a restaurant in Little Italy. Present were Luciano, his underboss Vito Genovese, and representatives from several other families. Domenico brought Giuseppe, now 15, but already his father's trusted consigliere. Luciano opened diplomatically. Domenico, your family's been doing good business, but there's talk. People say you're running things differently, that you got unusual beliefs about the work we do. Domenico didn't hesitate, didn't try to hide. We are different, Don Luciano. We understand what you don't, that we're not just criminals. We're instruments of divine justice. Our bloodline goes back to King David. We were chosen. Chosen by who? Genovese interrupted, his tone skeptical. By God himself, Domenico replied with absolute conviction. In a vision, he revealed our sacred purpose. Every man we judge, every business we control, every dollar we earn, it's all part of his plan to establish righteousness in a wicked world. The room fell silent. The other mobsters exchanged glances, unsure whether Domenico was putting on an elaborate act or genuinely believed what he was saying. Giuseppe, sitting beside his father, radiated the same intense conviction, showing no embarrassment or irony. Luciano, pragmatic to his core, tried another approach. Domenico, I respect that every man's got his own beliefs, but in our world, we got rules. We operate as businesses, not religions. Your family's methods, the rituals, the talk about divine missions, it attracts attention, makes people nervous. Let them be nervous, Domenico replied, his voice hardening. The wicked should fear the righteous. We don't answer to the commission, Don Luciano. We answer to a higher authority. It was a declaration of independence, a rejection of the mob's governing structure, and everyone in the room recognized it as such. Genovese's hand moved toward his jacket, but Luciano stopped him with a gesture. "That's dangerous talk, Domenico. Every family answers to the commission. That's how we maintain peace, how we avoid war." "You saying you're above that?" "I'm saying," Domenico leaned forward, his pale eyes burning with zealot fire, "that God's law supersedes man's law, including the commission's. If you want to do business with us, you respect our sacred mission. If not," he shrugged, "then you're either with righteousness or against it." Giuseppe had been silent throughout, but now he spoke, his young voice carrying his father's same fanaticism. "The Old Testament is clear, Don Luciano. The chosen people didn't make alliances with the pagans. They conquered them or separated from them. We extend respect to your families as fellow Italians, but our ultimate loyalty is to our divine calling." Luciano studied the 15-year-old with growing concern. The father was a dangerous fanatic, but the fact that the son had been so completely indoctrinated suggested this delusion would persist into the next generation. The Sarto family wasn't just unstable, it was a multi-generational cult operating inside the structure of organized crime. The meeting ended with superficial agreements and vague promises, but Luciano left convinced that the Sartos would eventually need to be dealt with. Their religious fanaticism made them unreliable, and their refusal to acknowledge the Commission's authority made them a threat to the careful balance he'd established. But dealing with the Sartos was complicated. They were effective, profitable, and their soldiers fought with suicidal courage. More importantly, they had no obvious successors. Domenico's eldest son was still a teenager, and removing the leadership would likely trigger a violent succession struggle. So Luciano decided to wait and watch, hoping the Sartos would either moderate their behavior or self-destruct through their own fanaticism. It would take 7 more years, but Luciano's prediction would prove correct. The end of World War II in 1945 brought massive changes to organized crime in America. Soldiers returned home, creating labor surplus and social disruption that the mob exploited ruthlessly. The economy boomed, creating new opportunities for legitimate and illegitimate businesses. And federal law enforcement, which had been focused on wartime concerns, refocused on domestic crime with new resources and determination. For most mob families, this meant adapting, becoming more careful, more sophisticated, more integrated into legitimate business structures. For the Sartos, it meant doubling down on their religious delusion. Domenico interpreted the Allies' victory as proof of divine favor for the righteous. He began preaching that the family had been blessed because of their faithfulness, that their prosperity was evidence of God's approval. This confirmation bias, interpreting success as divine validation, deepened the family's commitment to their twisted theology. Giuseppe, now a young man of 16, took on increasing responsibility for the family's operations. He proved to be strategically brilliant, combining his father's zealotry with a shrewd understanding of business and violence. But his brilliance was always filtered through the religious framework. He didn't make decisions based on profit or risk. He made them based on what he believed God wanted the chosen family to do. In 1946, Giuseppe led his first major operation without his father's direct supervision. A rival family, the Marconis, had been moving into Sarto territory in Red Hook. Rather than negotiating or simply assassinating the Marconi leadership, Giuseppe orchestrated an elaborate campaign he called Divine Retribution. He spent weeks researching the Marconi family, documenting their crimes not for strategic purposes, but to build a religious case against them. He compiled evidence of their adultery, their blasphemy, their cruelty to the poor, every sin he could identify. Then he brought this indictment to the chamber, where Domenico reviewed it and declared the Marconi leadership worthy of sacrifice. What followed was a week of coordinated violence that became legend in Brooklyn's underworld. Giuseppe personally led teams that systematically eliminated 7 key Marconi members. But these weren't simple assassinations. Each was staged as a judgment. The bodies were left in public places with biblical verses pinned to their chests. Domenico insisted on this. He wanted everyone to know that the Sartos weren't just killing enemies. They were executing divine will. The Marconi family crumbled within a month, and the Sartos absorbed their territory. But the manner of the killings attracted exactly the kind of attention Luciano had warned about. The press, always hungry for sensational mob stories, dubbed the unknown killers the righteous ones. Police launched a major investigation, and other mob families began to seriously question whether the Sartos' methods were sustainable. Domenico should have pulled back, should have recognized the danger. Instead, he declared the campaign a triumph and had the 7 Marconi victims added to the sacrifice count in the chamber. Their skulls were eventually interred in the walls marked with the Tet symbol, memorialized as enemies of God's chosen people. This pattern, violence escalating, religious fervor intensifying, reality being systematically denied in favor of delusional interpretation, continued throughout the late 1940s. The Sarto family grew richer and more powerful, but also more isolated and more dangerous to themselves and others. The breaking point began in 1948 with the birth of Giuseppe's first child. Giuseppe had married in 1947, choosing a bride from a deeply religious family who'd been vetted by Domenico for both piety and fertility. The marriage was described in family documents not as a union of love, but as a strategic breeding decision to ensure the continuation of the sacred bloodline. Giuseppe's wife, Teresa, was 17 years old, he was 19, and she had no real understanding of what she was marrying into. When their son was born in March of 1948, Domenico declared it a prophetic sign. He named the baby David, explicitly connecting him to King David, and announced that this child would lead the chosen family into a new era of power and righteousness. Teresa was horrified to hear her infant described in such terms, but she was young, isolated, and completely controlled by the Sarto family structure. The baby's christening wasn't held in a church. Instead, Domenico performed an elaborate ceremony in the chamber, baptizing little David with water, mixed with wine and olive oil, anointing him while reciting prayers in Latin, Hebrew, and Italian. The entire extended family attended, along with key soldiers, all of whom swore oaths to protect and serve the sacred heir. It was during this ceremony that Teresa first saw the chamber, the biblical verses covering the walls, the altar in the center, the genealogy painted on the ceiling connecting her infant son to ancient kings. But worse was the alcove she glimpsed when someone moved aside a curtain. Niches carved into the wall, each containing a human skull marked with Hebrew letters. Teresa started screaming. She grabbed baby David and tried to run, but the chamber's entrance was blocked by family members. Giuseppe caught her, held her while she thrashed and wept, and then Domenico approached. The old man, he was now 52 but looked 70, aged by decades of stress and fanaticism, placed his hand on Teresa's head and began praying, not in Italian, but in a mix of Latin and what he thought was Hebrew, speaking in tongues, calling down blessing and peace on this troubled young woman who didn't understand the honor her son had been given. Teresa's screams subsided into whimpers, then silence. Whether she was overcome by the moment, psychologically broken, or simply exhausted, she stopped fighting. She never spoke of the chamber again, never questioned the family's beliefs, never tried to escape. Something in her had been fundamentally broken that night, and she spent the rest of her short life in a state of passive compliance. Giuseppe recognized what had happened to his wife. He'd watched his father break people's spirits before, but felt no guilt. In his worldview, Teresa's initial resistance was natural weakness. Her surrender was acceptance of divine truth. He documented it in his journal as the day Teresa understood our sacred mission. But Teresa's trauma had consequences. She became withdrawn, barely functional, caring for baby David mechanically but without connection. By 1950, she developed what would now be diagnosed as severe clinical depression and PTSD. The family interpreted this as spiritual weakness and responded with prayer and religious instruction rather than medical care. In January of 1951, Teresa committed suicide. She walked into the East River at dawn and drowned herself, leaving behind a 2-year-old son and a husband who mourned her as a casualty of spiritual warfare, a righteous woman who couldn't handle the burden of birthing and raising a sacred heir. The family held a funeral, but Domenico refused to allow Teresa burial in consecrated ground. She'd committed the sin of self-murder, he declared, and therefore forfeited her place in the sacred lineage. Her body was cremated and her ashes scattered in unceremonious fashion, as if she'd never existed. Giuseppe, now 21 years old and hardened by years of violence and indoctrination, absorbed this tragedy without apparent emotion. He wrote in his journal, "God required a sacrifice of Abraham, his own son. He required sacrifice of me, my wife. I accept his will and continue his work. David will be raised by the family, trained from infancy in our sacred traditions, and will become the greatest of our line." The death of Teresa should have been a warning, evidence that the family's delusion was destroying lives, that children were being damaged, that the cycle needed to be broken. Instead, it only intensified their commitment to the belief system that had killed her. Marco Sarto, Giuseppe's younger brother, had watched Teresa's decline with clinical interest. Now 19 years old, Marco had developed into something even more disturbing than his father or brother, a true sociopath wrapped in religious justification. Where Domenico believed his own delusions and Giuseppe operated within the framework of inherited faith, Marco seemed to understand on some level that it was all fabrication, but embraced it anyway because it gave him permission for cruelty. In private journals discovered after the family's fall, Marco's writings reveal a chilling self-awareness. One entry from 1951 reads, "Father believes God speaks to him. Giuseppe believes we are chosen, but I know the truth. We choose ourselves. The divine lineage is fiction, but it's useful fiction. It transforms murder from sin into sacrament, theft from crime into tribute. The sheep need shepherds, the masses need myths. We provide both and profit from their weakness. If this makes me wicked, then wickedness is more honest than righteousness." Marco's nihilistic understanding of the family's operations made him incredibly dangerous. He carried out sacrifices with enthusiasm, not because he believed they were holy, but because he enjoyed the power and the ritual. He was a monster playing dress-up as a prophet, and everyone around him was too indoctrinated to recognize the difference. By 1952, the Sarto family had reached the height of their power. They controlled significant criminal operations across Brooklyn, had political connections throughout the city, and commanded absolute loyalty from dozens of soldiers who genuinely believed they were serving God's chosen family. On paper, they were one of the most successful crime families in New York, but internally they were fracturing. Francesca Sarto, now 19 years old, had begun to question. Unlike her brothers, she'd received some education outside the family. Domenico had allowed her to attend Catholic school, believing the nuns would reinforce religious devotion. Instead, exposure to actual Catholic theology highlighted how twisted her family's beliefs were. The real Catholic faith preached mercy, forgiveness, and redemption. Her family preached judgment, vengeance, and divine violence. The real faith condemned murder as mortal sin. Her family celebrated it as holy duty. The dissonance became unbearable, and Francesca began secretly meeting with a priest from her school, Father Michael O'Connor, trying to understand why her family's religion felt wrong. Father O'Connor, a young Irish priest from a working-class background, initially assumed Francesca was exaggerating or misunderstanding her family's beliefs. But as she described the chamber, the sacrifices, the elaborate theology of divine lineage, he realized he was hearing something genuinely disturbing, a family that had constructed an entire heretical belief system to justify organized crime. "What you're describing isn't Catholicism," Father O'Connor told her during one clandestine meeting in late 1952. "It's not even Christianity. It's a blasphemous distortion that takes the worst elements of Old Testament violence and removes all context of mercy and redemption." "But my father says we're chosen." "Francesca, listen to me carefully. God doesn't choose families to commit murder. He doesn't bless crime. The idea that your bloodline is sacred, that you're descended from King David, that violence in God's name is holy, it's all lies. Lies your father believes, lies that have poisoned your whole family. And if you don't escape, those lies will destroy you too." This conversation was overheard. One of Domenico's soldiers, following Francesca because the family had grown suspicious of her frequent absences, heard enough through the church confessional's thin walls to report back. And Domenico's response revealed just how deeply twisted the family had become. He didn't confront Francesca directly. Instead, he called a family meeting in the chamber, the entire extended family, all the key soldiers, and delivered a sermon about betrayal. He spoke about Judas, about family members who'd lost faith, about the necessity of pruning the family tree to keep it holy. Then he announced that Francesca would undergo spiritual correction. She would be confined to the house, cut off from outside contact, and subjected to intensive religious instruction until she recanted her doubts and recommitted to the family's sacred mission. For 3 months, Francesca was a prisoner in her own home. Marco took particular pleasure in her correction, spending hours lecturing her about divine selection and family obligation, making thinly veiled threats about what happened to those who betrayed the chosen lineage. Domenico forced her to transcribe his visions and copy biblical verses until her hands cramped. Giuseppe, more pragmatic, simply told her that if she ever spoke to outsiders about family business again, she'd be judged as a traitor. The psychological torture broke Francesca's resistance, but not her spirit. She learned to pretend, to mouth the right prayers, to express the right sentiments, to convince her captors that she'd been successfully re-indoctrinated. But internally, she began planning escape. Her chance came in April of 1953. The family was distracted by a major operation. Giuseppe was negotiating a territory dispute with another family, and surveillance on Francesca had relaxed slightly. She managed to slip out of the house early one morning and made her way to the parish where Father O'Connor worked. "Help me," she begged. "They're going to kill me eventually. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but the moment they decide I'm too dangerous to keep alive, I'll become another sacrifice in that chamber. You have to help me disappear." Father O'Connor faced an impossible choice. Helping Francesca escape would put both their lives at risk. The Sartos would hunt them relentlessly, but abandoning her meant condemning a young woman to probable death at the hands of her own family. He chose mercy. Through connections in the Catholic worker movement, Father O'Connor arranged for Francesca to be hidden in a convent in upstate New York, far from the Sartos' reach. She left Brooklyn with nothing but the clothes she wore, cutting all ties with her family, abandoning her identity to save her life. When the family discovered her gone, Domenico's rage was biblical. He declared Francesca dead to the family, ordered her name removed from the genealogy painted in the chamber, and swore that if she ever returned or contacted them, she would be sacrificed as punishment for betrayal. But privately, Giuseppe worried. Francesca knew everything: the chamber, the sacrifices, the twisted theology, the entire structure of the family's operations. If she went to the authorities, if she testified, the chosen family would be destroyed. Marco suggested simply killing her, finding the convent, eliminating both Francesca and the priest who'd helped her, making it look like an accident. But Domenico refused. Despite his rage, some vestige of paternal feeling prevented him from ordering his daughter's murder. Instead, he declared that she'd been tested and found wanting, cast out like the unfaithful, and was no longer worthy of the family's attention. This was a mistake. Francesca had escaped, but she hadn't yet gone to the authorities. She was traumatized, confused about what was truth and what was family mythology, uncertain whether anyone would believe her stories about ritual murders and divine genealogies. She hid in the convent, trying to heal, trying to understand what had been done to her. She might have stayed silent forever if the family hadn't made one final, catastrophic mistake. In August of 1954, Giuseppe's son David, now 6 years old and being raised by the extended family after his mother's suicide, began showing signs of psychological disturbance. He had violent outbursts, harmed small animals, showed no empathy for other children. Modern psychiatry would likely diagnose emerging antisocial personality disorder, perhaps complicated by trauma from being raised in a cult environment. But the family interpreted his behavior as evidence of prophetic power, warrior spirit, the mark of someone destined for greatness in the sacred lineage. Rather than getting him help, they celebrated his cruelty as righteousness. Domenico, now 58 and in failing health, decided that David needed to be initiated into the family's deepest secrets. Despite the boy's young age, Domenico brought him into the chamber and explained the sacrifices, the divine mission, the sacred genealogy. He showed David the skulls in the wall and told him these were enemies of God's chosen people, judged and executed by righteous ancestors. David's response was to ask when he could perform his own sacrifice. Giuseppe recorded this moment with pride in his journal. "My son understands his destiny, At 6 years old, he grasps what took me years to comprehend. He is truly the anointed one, the culmination of our bloodline. God has prepared him for greatness. The family began actively preparing David for his first kill. They chose a target, a small-time thief who'd stolen from one of the family's businesses, and planned an elaborate ritual sacrifice for David's 7th birthday in March of 1955. It would be his initiation, his proof of worthiness, his entry into the sacred duty of the chosen lineage. This plan never came to fruition because someone finally stopped them. Father O'Connor had maintained loose contact with Francesca through the convent's mother superior. He knew she was struggling, knew she was afraid, knew she carried terrible secrets. In early 1955, he convinced her that silence was its own kind of complicity, that by hiding what she knew, she was enabling more victims, more sacrifices, more children being raised in psychological horror. In February of 1955, Francesca walked into the FBI's New York field office and told them everything. The agents who interviewed her initially thought she was delusional. Her story seemed too bizarre. A mob family that believed they were descended from King David, that performed religious sacrifices, that maintained a hidden chamber full of victims' remains. It sounded like the ravings of someone with mental illness, but Francesca provided specific details: addresses, names, dates of disappearances, descriptions of the chamber's layout. She drew maps showing where the entrance was located. She explained the family's operational structure, their criminal enterprises, their connections to other families. The mix of verifiable criminal information and bizarre religious claims was compelling. The FBI assigned Special Agent Thomas Hartley to investigate. Hartley was a former military intelligence officer, skeptical but thorough. He began by verifying Francesca's claims about the family's criminal operations. Everything checked out. The Sartos were indeed running illegal businesses, had connections to known mobsters, and were suspected in several unsolved murders. But could the religious elements be true? Were there really sacrificial victims in a hidden chamber? Hartley began surveillance on the Carroll Gardens brownstone. For months he documented the family's movements, identified key members, mapped their operations. He saw Giuseppe coming and going with soldiers, saw Marco's violent enforcement actions, saw young David being treated with unusual reverence by hardened criminals. But he found no evidence of the chamber. No one entered or exited from the basement. Inspection permits showed only a standard residential basement. There was nothing on paper or invisible observation to support Francesca's claims about a hidden sanctuary. Hartley was about to conclude the religious elements were either fabrications or hallucinations, trauma-induced false memories from an abused daughter, when he got lucky. In October of 1955, one of Domenico's soldiers, a man named Carmine Basso, got arrested on unrelated charges. Facing serious prison time, Carmine decided to cooperate with federal authorities. He couldn't provide evidence about the chamber. He'd never been allowed inside. But he confirmed that the Sarto family was deeply strange, that they talked about divine missions and sacred lineage, that certain people were brought to the house and never seen again. It wasn't proof, but it was corroboration. The FBI now had two independent sources describing the same bizarre behavior. Hartley secured a search warrant based on suspected criminal activity, and on November 18, 1955, federal agents raided the Sarto home. What they found that day would make headlines across the country. The raid happened at dawn. 20 federal agents, backed by NYPD officers, stormed the brownstone with overwhelming force. They arrested Domenico, Giuseppe, Marco, and a dozen soldiers who'd been present for a late-night meeting. The family members were separated immediately, preventing any coordination of stories. The agents searched the house methodically. They found weapons, illegal gambling records, evidence of loan sharking and extortion, standard mob material. But they found no chamber, no altar, no bodies. Hartley, directing the search, felt growing frustration. Had Francesca invented everything? Was this an elaborate fantasy? He was about to call off the search of the basement when one agent noticed something odd. The basement's dimensions didn't match the house's footprint. There was a spatial discrepancy, approximately 20 feet of width that couldn't be accounted for by walls or utilities. Somewhere there was hidden space. It took 4 hours of systematic examination before they found the entrance. It wasn't in the basement itself, but accessed through the back of a ground-floor closet. A seemingly solid brick wall was actually mounted on hidden hinges, operated by a complex pressure release system that required precisely positioned weight on 3 different points. When that false wall finally swung open, revealing stairs descending into darkness, the agents drew their weapons and descended carefully, unsure what they'd find. The smell hit them first. Incense mixed with something older, mustier, disturbing. Then their flashlights illuminated the chamber, and even experienced federal agents stopped dead, trying to process what they were seeing. The walls covered with biblical verses in 3 languages, the altar at the center, the elaborate genealogy on the ceiling with gold leaf lettering, and along one wall, partially hidden by curtains, the niches containing 11 human skulls, each marked with Hebrew characters. "Jesus Christ," one agent whispered, then crossed himself, aware of the blasphemy of that phrase in this context. Hartley stood in the center of the chamber, slowly turning, taking in every detail. This wasn't just evidence of murder. This was evidence of madness, of systematic delusion maintained across decades, of a family that had transformed criminal enterprise into religious cult. Forensic specialists were called in. Photographers documented everything. The skulls were carefully removed and sent for analysis. Every document in the chamber, and there were hundreds, including Domenico's journals, Giuseppe's records, Marco's disturbing writings, was seized as evidence. The investigation that followed would take 3 years to complete and would expose the full scope of the Sarto family's crimes. The forensic analysis identified the 11 bodies in the chamber walls. They included Salvatore Russo, 1936, the first sacrifice 3 members of the Marconi family from Giuseppe's 1946 campaign, 2 corrupt cops who'd been blackmailing the family, 1947, a journalist who'd been investigating mob activities, 1949, a federal informant, 1950, an accountant who'd discovered financial irregularities, 1951, 2 rival mobsters, 1953. Each had been killed in elaborate ritual fashion, their deaths documented in the family's records as sacrifices to ensure divine blessing. But the chamber contained evidence of far more murders. Domenico's journals listed over 60 judgments carried out between 1923 and 1955. Most of these victims had been disposed of conventionally, dumped in rivers, buried in remote locations, cremated, but all had been selected and killed based on the family's twisted theology. The trial began in March of 1956 and became a media sensation. The prosecution presented a case that combined traditional organized crime charges with evidence of what they called religiously motivated murder conspiracy. They brought psychologists to testify about the family's delusional system, explaining how cult-like indoctrination had created multiple generations of true believers who genuinely thought murder was holy duty. Francesca testified, though it traumatized her to face her family across a courtroom. She described her childhood, the indoctrination, the chamber ceremonies she'd witnessed, the psychological abuse she'd endured when she questioned. Her testimony was devastating precisely because it was clear she wasn't exaggerating. If anything, she was understating the horror to maintain her own sanity. The defense tried to argue insanity, claiming the Sartos genuinely believed their delusions and therefore couldn't be held criminally responsible. But the prosecution countered that the family's sophisticated criminal operations, their careful record-keeping, their strategic planning, all demonstrated they understood perfectly well what they were doing. They'd simply constructed religious justifications for actions they knew were illegal and immoral. Domenico, now 60, testified in his own defense. His testimony was rambling, fervent, unshakable in conviction. He quoted biblical passages, explained his vision, insisted that everything he'd done was righteous and necessary. He showed no remorse, no doubt, no recognition that he'd ruined lives and destroyed his own family. "I am a judge of Israel," he declared from the stand. "God chose my bloodline. Everything I did was in service to him. Every man I killed deserved judgment. Every dollar I earned was tribute to the righteous. My only regret is that I didn't kill more of the wicked before you arrested me. But that's all right. God will raise up others from my line to continue his work. The sacred mission doesn't end with me." Giuseppe's testimony was similar, but more controlled. He acknowledged the killings but maintained they were justified executions, not murders. He defended his father's vision and his own role in implementing it. He expressed no remorse except that his son David would grow up without his father's guidance. Guidance he clearly intended to be continued indoctrination into the family's delusional system. Marco's testimony was chilling in a different way. Unlike his father and brother, Marco seemed almost amused by the proceedings. He admitted to multiple killings, described them in detail, and showed no religious fervor, just cold satisfaction. When asked if he believed the family was truly chosen by God, he smiled and said, "Does it matter? We believed it, and belief is power. We built an empire on that belief. Whether God exists or not, we made ourselves gods in our own kingdom." The jury deliberated for 8 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Domenico, Giuseppe, and Marco were each convicted of multiple counts of murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. Federal prosecutors had decided not to seek the death penalty, partly because of the insanity questions, and partly because life imprisonment seemed more appropriate for men who believed themselves divinely protected. Let them discover that God wasn't going to miraculously free them from prison. Domenico died in federal prison in 1961 at age 65, still insisting to anyone who'd listen that he was a righteous man being persecuted for serving God. His final words, according to the prison chaplain who attended him, were, "Tell my grandson David that the line continues. Tell him to remember his sacred duty." Giuseppe lasted longer, serving 23 years before dying of a heart attack in 1979. Prison records indicate he spent his incarceration trying to convert other inmates to his belief system, with limited success. He maintained correspondence with David and other family members, letters filled with biblical references and coded instructions to maintain the faith. Marco proved to be the most disturbing. Without the religious framework to constrain him, he became simply a violent sociopath. He was involved in multiple prison murders and spent most of his sentence in solitary confinement. He died in 1988, killed by another inmate in circumstances that remain officially unexplained, but were likely a sanctioned hit by prisoners who'd tired of his violence. The remaining Sarto family members, cousins, wives, younger children, scattered after the trial. Some changed their names, some left New York entirely. The criminal organization collapsed immediately, with territory absorbed by other families and soldiers finding new crews. But the most troubling question remained: what happened to David? David Sarto was 7 years old when his father and grandfather were arrested. He'd been present for some of the family's ceremonies, had been shown the chamber, had been raised from birth to believe he was sacred heir to a divine lineage. The state placed him in foster care, and psychologists worked with him for years, trying to deprogram the indoctrination. Records from this period are sealed, but what's known is disturbing. David continued to exhibit violent behavior, continued to talk about his sacred mission, continued to believe he was special and chosen. Multiple foster families couldn't handle him. He was in and out of psychiatric facilities throughout his adolescence. In 1965, at age 17, David legally changed his name and disappeared from public records. The FBI maintained a file on him for decades, concerned that he might attempt to rebuild the family's criminal empire, or worse, continue the twisted religious mission. But no concrete evidence ever emerged that he'd committed any crimes as an adult. Some former federal agents believe David eventually integrated into normal society, that the therapeutic intervention finally worked, that he overcame his indoctrination. Others believe he simply got better at hiding, that somewhere there's a man in his 70s who still believes he's descended from King David and has a divine right to judge the wicked. The truth may never be known. The Carroll Gardens brownstone was eventually demolished in 1972, but not before extensive forensic excavation revealed evidence of additional bodies beneath the basement floor, remains too old and degraded to identify, but suggesting the family's practice of ritual sacrifice may have begun even before 1936. The site remained vacant for years, too tainted by history for anyone to want to build there. In the late 1980s, a developer finally purchased the lot and constructed a small apartment building, but tenants reported strange sounds from the basement, feelings of oppression and dread. The building has struggled with vacancies ever since, with locals claiming it's cursed by the Sartos' victims. The 11 identified victims were eventually given proper burial in a common grave at Calvary Cemetery, with a simple marker reading, "Those who were lost now found. May they rest in peace." Francesca Sarto, who testified so bravely despite enormous personal cost, never fully recovered from her childhood trauma. She remained in religious life, eventually taking vows as a nun, and spent her remaining years working with victims of domestic violence and cult survivors. She rarely spoke publicly about her family, but in a 1982 interview for an academic study on religious extremism, she offered this reflection. "People ask me how my family could believe such things, how they could convince themselves that murder was holy. But it's not complicated. Everyone wants to be special. Everyone wants to believe their suffering has meaning, their life has purpose. My father took that universal desire and twisted it into something monstrous. He gave desperate men a story where they were heroes instead of criminals, where their violence was righteous instead of evil. And once they accepted that story, once they built their identities around it, they couldn't let it go without admitting their entire lives were lies. So they held onto the delusion, passed it to their children, and created hell while calling it heaven." Francesca died in 1997 at age 64, having spent her final years advocating for better mental health treatment for children in extremist households. Father O'Connor, who saved her life by helping her escape, attended her funeral and delivered a eulogy praising her courage in breaking free from generations of delusion. The scholarly analysis of the Sarto family has continued for decades. Psychologists study them as an example of how intergenerational trauma and religious delusion can create closed systems of belief resistant to outside reality. Criminologists examine them as a unique intersection of organized crime and cult behavior. Religious scholars use them as a cautionary tale about the dangers of separating divine law from moral reasoning. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Sarto family is simpler and more disturbing. The human capacity for self-deception is nearly infinite when the truth threatens our sense of identity and purpose. Domenico Sarto wasn't born a monster. He was born a desperate immigrant looking for meaning in a hostile world. He found that meaning in a delusion, wrapped it in religious language, and passed it to his children as sacred truth. 3 generations believed they were chosen by God. 3 generations committed atrocities in the name of righteousness. 3 generations lived and died without ever recognizing that their divine mission was nothing more than criminal enterprise dressed in biblical language. In the end, the Sarto family's greatest crime wasn't murder or extortion or conspiracy. It was the crime of stealing reality from their own children, of replacing truth with mythology so compelling that it doomed everyone who believed it. And somewhere, perhaps, an elderly man sits alone in a room looking at a family Bible filled with margin notes, connecting him to King David, still believing despite everything that he is special, chosen, sacred, still waiting for God to reveal his next mission, still trapped in a delusion that began with a fever dream in 1923 and consumed 3 generations before finally being exposed in a basement chamber full of bones and biblical verses and the shattered remains of human dignity. The Sarto family believed their lineage was chosen by God. History remembers them as a cautionary tale about the danger of confusing divine calling with criminal ambition, sacred duty with murderous delusion, and righteousness with the absence of accountability. Their story ends not with redemption, but with a question that haunts everyone who studies them. How many other families, how many other individuals are living in similar delusions right now, convinced their cruelty is justified, their violence is sacred, their crimes are holy, simply because questioning their beliefs would mean admitting their lives have been lies? The answer, unfortunately, is probably more than we'd like to believe.